Under the dim glow of vintage stage lights, a grainy clip of a young singer freezes mid-note, her voice soaring over a roaring 1980s crowd. Flashbulbs ignite, illuminating her radiant face, a moment of pure triumph. Headlines spin across the screen. The new soul queen, Prince calls her voice divine. The energy peaks, then abruptly cuts to darkness. A faint hum of tape static lingers as a single line appears. And then, she disappeared for 20 years. The late 1980s shimmered with restless energy, the kind that belonged to neon lights, flickering club marquees, and the endless hum of ambition. In the heart of Minneapolis, a young woman with a voice that seemed too vast for her frame began to carve her place in the world. Her nights were spent in the smoky haze of small bars, where wooden stages creaked beneath her feet, and audiences leaned forward as though afraid to miss a single note. She had a way of making silence feel like part of the song, letting the anticipation build until the first note floated into the air, soft but unyielding, carrying the kind of emotional weight that could pull a room into stillness. Patrons who had come only for a drink would pause mid-conversation, their words hanging in the air, their eyes finding her. Something in her voice carried the promise of escape and the ache of memory, a thread of humanity that bound strangers together for the length of a song. The city itself seemed to conspire with her rise. Minneapolis pulsed with its own musical heartbeat, a mixture of funk, soul, and the electric crackle of the 80s sound. Studio basements and makeshift rehearsal rooms became her sanctuaries. She sang until her lungs ached, until the thin carpet beneath her feet was darkened with sweat, until the producers on the other side of the glass simply stared, knowing they were witnessing something they might never touch again. Her notebooks filled with half-formed lyrics, doodles, and the desperate scratches of someone who feared the world would forget her if she stopped creating for even a moment. She slept little, ate less, and chased the fleeting high of every small success with the hunger of someone who understood how quickly dreams could wither. There were nights when the city gave her back her own reflection, magnified through its streets and lights. Posters with her image began to appear outside local clubs, grainy black and white photographs promising audiences a new voice worth discovering. Musicians in the scene spoke her name in the cramped hallways of studios and backstage corridors, voices tinged with curiosity and awe. Fans began to linger after shows, hoping for a glimpse of the girl who had made them cry without knowing why. Her joy in those moments was real, unguarded, as if each night she stepped onto the stage, she was discovering her purpose all over again. Yet beneath the glow of her ascent, a shadow had already begun to form, invisible but steady, the quiet reminder that such light always draws darkness eventually. The breakthrough came like a spark catching in dry grass. A local producer captured one of her live performances on a handheld camera, the footage raw and imperfect, and sent it to a network of musicians and label scouts. One of those tapes found its way into the orbit of a man whose influence in the music world was gravitational. Prince, always searching for voices that could move between vulnerability and fire, watched her sing with an intensity that felt almost reverent. In a fleeting interview captured by a local station, he would later call her voice divine, a word he rarely used for anyone. For a brief moment, the city seemed to pulse with her name, the buzz of inevitability settling into every corner of her life. The stage lights grew brighter, the crowds thicker, and yet every frame of old footage carries the same quiet truth. Her eyes, wide and bright, are searching for something far beyond fame, something that applause could never quite satisfy. Old photographs show her in thrift store jackets and glittering earrings, framed by friends and fellow musicians who orbit her rise with affection and envy. There is one image, slightly out of focus, where she is laughing so hard her head is thrown back, and for a second it is possible to believe she has outrun the weight of the world. Her voice, in recordings from that era, trembles with youth and power, both fragile and unstoppable. Listeners described feeling a chill run through their bones the first time they heard her, as though some secret had been whispered just for them. Local radio DJs began spinning her songs between tracks from global stars, their voices heavy with the certainty that a phenomenon was beginning. And then, as quickly as the momentum built, silence began to creep in. In the footage that survives, the glow of stage lights fades into static, and the images of her smiling face blur as if time itself refuses to hold on to them. Friends recall the first missed rehearsals, the unanswered calls, the empty stool in the corner of the studio. The city that had celebrated her moved on with the speed of urban life, its noise swallowing her absence. Newspapers stopped printing her name. Her posters, once vibrant, faded in the sun until only the faint outline of her face remained. For those who had heard her voice, the memory lingered like an echo, refusing to die. But for the world at large, she became a ghost of a promise that had almost been fulfilled. Her prologue ends not with a bang, but with a lingering, haunting note that seems to suspend itself in air before fading completely. It leaves behind an emptiness, the sense that a story has begun, but the pages have been torn out, scattered somewhere just beyond reach. In that silence, the seeds of mystery are planted, waiting for the world to ask the question it had once been too distracted to consider. Where did the divine voice go, and why did she leave it all behind? The first rays of success fell on her like stage lights warming the skin after hours of darkness. The clubs that once offered her only scattered applause now filled to the walls, bodies pressed close, eyes turned toward the slight figure at the microphone. The city seemed to hum with her presence, as if the streets themselves anticipated her next performance. She moved through this new world with a fragile mixture of wonder and certainty, her footsteps echoing in rehearsal rooms where the floor still smelled of sawdust and sweat. Every day began with the rhythm of her own ambition, her voice stretching through warm-ups, her mind looping melodies over and over until they fused with her bones. She learned to navigate the labyrinth of opportunity, a maze where every turn offered either the promise of brilliance or the shadow of disappointment. The rise unfolded in fragments, each moment a spark feeding a larger flame. Local radio stations played her first recordings late at night, wedged between the hits of the era, yet her voice had a way of stopping listeners mid-motion. They called in to ask who she was, a new singer whose notes curled around memory like smoke. The city's music scene began to fold her into its mythology, placing her alongside the greats who had risen before her. She would enter a studio and the air would shift, the quiet acknowledgement that something electric had arrived. Engineers leaned closer to the mixing boards, musicians adjusted their playing, and producers watched her as though waiting for lightning to strike twice in the same room. Her days became a blur of rehearsals, recording sessions, and hurried meals in the corners of studios. She poured herself into every note, every line, as if her voice could carve a permanent place in a world that so easily forgets. On stage, she transformed. The shy girl who wandered the streets of Minneapolis became a force, commanding the space with a presence that was both ethereal and unshakable. Stage lights bounced off her earrings, painting the air with small constellations, and in the eyes of the audience she could see belief blooming. When she sang, time seemed to stretch, the moments folding in on themselves, and for a heartbeat, the city belonged entirely to her. Prince's acknowledgement became the spark that turned quiet admiration into wildfire. His word carried weight heavier than any magazine feature or radio play. When he called her voice divine, the music world listened. It was more than praise. It was a kind of anointment, a passing of the torch from one artist who lived in the stratosphere to another just beginning to lift off. Invitations followed, first from local venues that had once overlooked her, then from out-of-town stages where the lights burned hotter and the expectations towered higher. Her name began to appear in print, her face on small posters that fluttered against street lamps and bar windows. Photographers captured her mid-song, eyes closed, lost in the kind of trance that only music could conjure. The world around her responded with both devotion and hunger. Friends became part of the orbit, their lives rearranging around the demands of her rise. Late-night drives through the city became rituals, the car stereo spilling rough cuts of her tracks as the skyline shimmered against the dark. She wrote songs in the margins of notebooks, on receipts, even on the back of flyers for her own shows. Each melody came to her like a secret whispered by the universe, and she felt compelled to catch it before it disappeared. She learned to live between exhaustion and exhilaration, between the lonely quiet of hotel rooms and the roaring heat of the stage. Audiences grew bolder in their adoration. After shows, hands reached for her, not to hold her down, but to capture some part of the magic she gave away with every performance. She smiled. She signed set lists and scraps of paper. She let strangers hug her as if they had known her their entire lives. Fame, in its earliest form, was intoxicating, not yet heavy enough to crush her, only light enough to make her feel untouchable. She began to believe, if only for moments, that this ascent would never end, that she could outrun the shadows that had followed her through empty clubs and silent streets. Yet woven into the climb were hints of the weight it carried, the endless travel, the demand to always be brilliant, the subtle shift in the eyes of those who once called themselves friends. Some looked at her with pride, others with envy, and a few with the cold calculation of opportunity. Nights blurred into mornings, mornings into nights, until the calendar became a smear of obligations. Even in moments of triumph, there were flickers of loneliness, the creeping awareness that applause could only fill the void for so long. In rare, quiet hours, she would stare at her reflection in the dark window of a hotel room, the city lights behind her, and search for the girl who once sang just to hear her own heart echo back. Still, the rise was undeniable. Her name became a whispered promise, her music a bridge between strangers. Journalists began to call, magazines requested interviews, and producers floated the idea of a debut album that could carry her beyond the city and into the world. She stood on the edge of that possibility, her voice as strong as ever, her heart racing with the thrill of momentum. For 5 luminous minutes of her life, stretched across months of relentless pursuit, she was everything the world wanted her to be. And for a fleeting moment, she almost believed she could be everything for herself, too. The world had become a blur of lights, sound, and relentless adoration. Her voice, once an intimate secret shared only in dim clubs and rehearsal rooms, now soared across stadiums filled with thousands of faces. From the first moment she stepped into the blinding glow of the stage, the roar of the crowd felt like a living thing, a tide that lifted her higher than she had ever imagined. Camera flashes sparked like lightning in the dark, and the air pulsed with the collective heartbeat of strangers who sang her lyrics back to her as if they were gospel. In those moments, suspended in a haze of spotlights and smoke, she was untouchable, a figure both human and mythic, breathing life into the music that had carried her from obscurity to the very summit of fame. Every city blurred into the next, airports merging with hotels, hotels with backstage corridors. The hours before each show were an endless choreography of movement, stylists and assistants orbiting her like satellites, their hands shaping her into the image the world expected to see. Mirrors reflected a version of herself she barely recognized, a woman draped in silk and sequins, her eyes rimmed with gold and shadow. The moment the curtain rose, the exhaustion vanished, replaced by the surge of power that came from thousands of voices calling her name. Time bent under the weight of adrenaline, each performance both a fleeting instant and an eternal imprint. Her life outside the stage became a series of fragments captured in passing. Limousines slid through city streets under the cover of night, fans clustering at barricades with trembling hands and cameras ready. Interviews filled the gaps between rehearsals. her answers polished into perfect anecdotes, while inside she floated in a haze of repetition. Awards arrived, heavy and cold in her hands, their gleam reflecting the relentless pace that carried her forward. Magazine covers framed her as a goddess of sound, a muse reborn, the divine voice that even Prince himself had once praised. Headlines chased her from one coast to the other, declaring her the future, the present, the phenomenon. In the quiet moments that slipped through the cracks, she felt the strange duality of her life. Alone in hotel suites high above unfamiliar cities, she would press her ear to the silence, the applause still echoing in her chest like phantom thunder. The bed, wide and soft, felt like a small island in an endless ocean, and she drifted between sleep and memory, haunted by the feeling that the world outside was moving faster than she could hold on to. Phone calls to old friends became shorter, less frequent, their laughter muted by the static of distance and time. The more the world claimed her, the more she wondered what part of herself remained truly her own. The peak was a whirlwind of brilliance and fragility. Music videos painted her in surreal landscapes, drenched in light and color, watched by millions around the globe. Fashion houses sent gowns from Paris and Milan, each one a statement of her arrival in the pantheon of icons. Photographers chased her down sidewalks, their shouts and camera shutters a constant percussion, while fans reached out from the edges of barricades with tears in their eyes. The adoration was intoxicating, but behind it pulsed an undercurrent of weight, a sense that she was balancing on a knife's edge, the world watching for either her next triumph or her first stumble. Every show at the peak of her fame felt like the climax of a lifetime. Stadiums shook beneath the pounding of drums, and her voice carried across the open air with a power that seemed impossible for someone so slight, so seemingly fragile in the quiet. Fireworks burst above outdoor stages, smoke curled through arenas, and the lights turned her into a silhouette of living fire. In those minutes, she became both entirely herself and someone beyond comprehension, a vessel for something greater than her own story. Fans screamed until their voices cracked, and somewhere in the chaos, she felt the fleeting illusion that she was infinite, that nothing could pull her down from this height. But in the edges of her vision, she could feel the shadows gathering. The interviews grew more probing, the expectations heavier, and the people around her began to speak of the next album, the next tour, the next step, before she had even caught her breath. Her reflection in the mirror became a stranger again, the makeup unable to disguise the exhaustion beneath her skin. The nights stretched longer, the mornings came sooner, and the applause, once all-consuming, began to feel like a wave receding from the shore, leaving her stranded on the sand. Still, for those fleeting minutes under the lights, the peak of her fame felt like a dream spun from starlight, a dream she feared she might wake from at any moment. The storm had been gathering in silence, building behind the glittering curtain of fame until it became impossible to ignore. At first it was subtle, a tremor running through the edges of her carefully constructed world. The exhaustion that had once ebbed after a night's sleep now lingered like a shadow, and the echo of applause no longer filled the hollow spaces inside her chest. Airports and hotel rooms blurred into an indistinguishable haze, each one leaving less of a mark than the last. The weight of constant expectation pressed down, every handshake and flashbulb stealing a fragment of something she could no longer name. She had given the world her voice, her image, her time, and somewhere in the relentless cycle of stages and cameras, she realized she no longer recognized the person reflected back at her in the glass. The signs of her unraveling came quietly. Concerts were postponed without warning, citing exhaustion or scheduling conflicts. Tabloids began to speculate, filling the vacuum of her silence with rumors that grew more elaborate with each passing week. She retreated behind hotel doors and blackout curtains, hiding from the world that had once lifted her so high. Her team grew frantic, fielding calls and crafting statements that painted her absence as temporary, as if the tidal wave of attention could be paused and rewound at will. Yet behind the walls, she drifted deeper into isolation, untethered from the rhythm that had once carried her life. One night, the decision came without fanfare. The city outside her window pulsed with light and life, but she felt detached from it, as if she were watching it all from underwater. She looked around the suite filled with unopened letters, designer clothes, and fading bouquets, and realized that none of it felt real anymore. The voice that had once defined her seemed distant, like a memory of someone else's dream. Without a word to anyone, she vanished into the folds of anonymity, leaving behind the machinery of fame to spin in confusion. Airports this time were chosen in secret, her name absent from manifests, her figure lost in the crowds she used to command. The world outside reacted with shock. Headlines screamed of disappearance and mystery. Her social media accounts fell silent, the last post frozen in time like a monument to a vanished era. Fans scoured every corner of the internet for clues, dissecting old interviews, lyrics, and photographs in the hope of understanding what had happened. Industry insiders whispered their own theories, some sympathetic, others cruel, but no one had an answer. The woman whose voice had once been called divine had simply ceased to exist in the public eye, as if she had been swallowed by her own shadow. In the quiet that followed, her absence became louder than her presence had ever been. Her songs still played on radios and streaming platforms, echoing across empty rooms. But they carried a new weight, a ghostly reminder of what had been lost. Her team eventually dissolved, her contracts lapsed, and the world slowly moved on, though never entirely. Every few years, a blurry photo or vague rumor would surface, reigniting the mystery, but each time it faded just as quickly, leaving only questions behind. For her, the silence became a kind of sanctuary, a space where she could exist without performance, without expectation, free from the relentless hunger of fame. Seasons changed, years passed, and the world that had once belonged to her shifted into something unrecognizable. New voices rose to fill the space she left behind, and the stage lights that had once burned for her now illuminated someone else's story. But her absence remained a wound in the memory of those who had been there at the height of her power, a reminder of how fragile and fleeting brilliance could be. In the end, her disappearance became its own legend, a haunting epilogue to a life that had once seemed untouchable, leaving behind only the echo of a voice that had once promised eternity. 2 decades had passed since she had last walked beneath the weight of stage lights, and the world she had left behind felt like a distant country she had only visited in a dream. Time had reshaped her life into something quieter. The once relentless rhythm of airports, interviews, and rehearsals replaced by mornings spent in anonymity. She had lived in small towns where no one looked twice at her in the grocery store, drifted along coastlines where the sea swallowed her name, and found solace in the kind of obscurity that fame had never allowed. For years, she had let the world forget her face, and in that forgetting, she found the fragments of herself she had lost. Yet the voice, the very gift that had made her extraordinary, never truly went silent. It hummed within her like a ghost, an echo waiting for a reason to rise again. The return began not with an announcement, but with a moment of quiet recognition. One evening, she sat in a dim cafe tucked into a narrow street, listening as a local singer fumbled through a cover of one of her own songs. The voice was raw, imperfect, but earnest, and it pierced through the shell of distance she had built around herself. Hearing her song reflected back at her after so many years was like a door unlocking, a reminder that her absence had never erased the imprint she left on the world. That night, she returned to the small rented house where she had been living and sang for the first time in years, letting the sound fill the empty rooms. It felt both foreign and familiar, as if she were reclaiming a language she had almost forgotten. Word of her resurfacing began as a whisper, a rumor that traveled through the delicate web of the music world. A grainy video uploaded by a stranger showed a woman with streaks of silver in her hair singing in a forgotten bar, her voice softened but still carrying the unmistakable resonance that had once stopped rooms cold. Within hours, the video spread, picked up by fans who had never stopped waiting, and the legend of her disappearance collided with the reality of her return. Journalists speculated, producers called, and offers surfaced, but she remained unmoved by the frenzy she had once fled. She had no interest in reclaiming the world as it had been. The world she sought now was smaller, quieter, and hers alone. When she finally stepped back into a proper recording studio, it was in secret. The room smelled of dust and wood, the equipment humming softly as if remembering her. She sang without the weight of expectation, not for charts or awards or headlines, but to finally hear herself fully again. The voice had changed, tempered by time and silence, carrying with it the raw honesty of someone who had lived outside the noise. When the first song was finished, she listened back with a stillness she had never known during her meteoric rise. The sound was imperfect, cracked in places, but real in a way she had always longed for. The world's reaction when she finally allowed her reemergence to become official was a storm of nostalgia and awe. Headlines marveled at her return, articles traced the arc of her vanishing, and social media erupted with tributes from a generation who had grown up on the ghost of her music. Concerts were proposed, interviews requested, documentaries planned, but she approached all of it with the caution of someone who had walked through fire. This time, there would be no surrender to the machinery of fame, no endless cycle to consume her life. She appeared selectively, carefully, as if guarding a treasure that could vanish again if overexposed. Her first public performance in 20 years was not in an arena or under stadium lights, but in a small theater where the audience sat close enough to see the quiet strength in her face. The room was silent as she began to sing, a single spotlight illuminating her as if the past had been waiting for this moment to breathe again. Each note carried the weight of her disappearance and the grace of her survival, and when the final note faded, the audience remained hushed for a heartbeat longer, caught between reverence and disbelief. In that moment, she was not the legend who had vanished, nor the mystery the world had tried to solve, but simply a woman who had found her way back to the voice that was always hers. The stage was bathed in a soft, golden light, and the air seemed to hold its breath as she stood at the center, the weight of 2 decades and an entire lifetime pressing against her chest. The theater was larger this time, but not the cavernous arenas she had once commanded. She had chosen this space deliberately, a hall built for sound rather than spectacle, where every note could hang in the air like a confession. The audience was a mixture of generations, some who had lived through her meteoric rise and sudden disappearance, and others who had only known her through old recordings and whispered stories. The energy in the room was unlike anything she had ever felt, not the fevered worship of fame, but something quieter and deeper, a collective acknowledgement that they were witnessing a moment that would not come again. When the first note left her lips, it was as though time bent to her will. The voice was no longer the crystalline perfection that had once stunned the world, but it carried a resonance that only years of living in silence could create. It was weathered and warm, fragile yet unbreakable, every breath laced with the truth of her journey. The song she chose to open with was new, born from the solitude of her self-imposed exile, but it flowed seamlessly into the legacy of the music she had left behind. As she sang, the audience leaned forward, caught in the gravity of her presence, the lines between past and present dissolving. Behind her, the band played with a careful tenderness, as if they too understood the sacredness of this return. Each instrument wove itself around her voice, leaving space for it to bloom fully. She closed her eyes and let the song carry her, feeling the vibrations through her chest, into her bones, into the quiet part of herself that had once sworn never to return to this world. The song's final note lingered in the air, and for a heartbeat, the room existed in perfect stillness before the sound of applause rose like a wave. It was not the wild roar of hysteria she had once known, but something richer, a standing ovation wrapped in reverence, gratitude, and awe. She performed for nearly an hour, moving through songs old and new, each carrying a weight that only deepened as the night went on. Some were sung exactly as they had been all those years ago, and the audience clung to every note, transported back to the nights when her music had first touched their lives. Others were stripped bare, rearranged into quiet meditations, her voice almost whispering truths that had never been spoken. Each song felt like a thread weaving a tapestry of closure and rebirth, a testament to survival, to the enduring nature of art, to the way music can hold a life inside it. As the final moments approached, she chose a song that had always haunted her, the very one that Prince had once called divine. It had been her signature, the piece that had carried her into the pantheon of rising stars, and the song that had followed her even into obscurity. Singing it now was not about reclaiming her past, but releasing it. The opening chords struck, and a hush fell over the room. She sang with her whole being, pouring 20 years of absence, pain, and quiet resurrection into every note. The song swelled to its climax, her voice breaking just slightly, and in that imperfection lay the truth of her journey. When the last note faded, the silence was absolute, and for a moment she wondered if the world itself had stopped to listen. The applause that followed was not just for her voice, but for the story of her life, for the choice to return on her own terms, for the courage to be vulnerable in a world that had once devoured her. She bowed, her hands trembling, her heart open in a way it had never been before. She left the stage slowly, not to thunderous chaos, but to an ocean of quiet love, the kind that does not demand, only receives. Backstage, she sat alone for a moment, feeling the echoes of her voice settle into the walls, into herself. She realized then that this was her finale, not an ending, but a full circle. She had given her gift back to the world, and the world had given her peace in return. Long after the audience had gone, the theater remained hushed, holding the memory of her voice like a sacred secret. Somewhere, beyond the lights and the lingering applause, her legacy lived untethered, no longer bound to the cycles of fame or the weight of expectation. She had returned, she had sung, and she had left behind a story that would echo for generations. In the quiet that followed, she stepped into the night, free.